every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The high desert of Utah's West Valley is a place of stark contrasts and planned conformity. It's a sprawling suburb of Salt Lake City, where the streets are laid out in neat, predictable grids. Their names: Sarah Circle, Constitution Drive, suggesting a quiet, orderly existence. Homes are modest, but well-kept, reflecting the values of the predominantly Latter-day Saint community that populates the area: family, faith, and stability. But this carefully manicured landscape pushes right up against the raw, untamed edge of the Oquirrh Mountains, a jagged spine of rock that serves as a constant reminder of the wilderness that lies just beyond the pavement. In winter, that wilderness becomes a formidable, alien world. On the night of December 6, 2009, that world came crashing into the suburbs. A blizzard tore through the region, a meteorological assault that buried the landscape in heavy, wet sheets of snow. The wind howled with an almost personal fury, driving the temperature down into the teens, a cold that felt sharp and predatory. It was a night to be inside, a night for locked doors, warm blankets, and it was a night no sane person would choose to spend in a tent, least of all with a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. Yet, according to Josh Powell, that is precisely where he was. This story begins with an absence. The absence of a mother at a daycare drop-off. The absence of a wife in her home. And most chillingly, the absence of any rational explanation for where she might be. When Susan Powell, a bright, effervescent 28-year-old mother of 2, vanished from the heart of that quiet suburb, her disappearance created a vacuum, and into that vacuum stepped her husband, Josh, with a story so bizarre, so transparently illogical, that it felt less like an alibi and more like a taunt. He claimed that in the dead of night, just after midnight, he had bundled his young sons, Charlie and Braden, into the family minivan and driven them into the teeth of that raging blizzard for a spur-of-the-moment camping trip. The destination he named was the Simpson Springs area of the West Desert, a place of remote, frozen beauty in the summer, but a desolate, life-threatening wasteland in the heart of a December snowstorm. From the very beginning, the story didn't just fail to add up. It seemed designed to provoke disbelief. It was a narrative gauntlet thrown down to investigators, to family, to the public. It was a performance, and the man at the center of that performance would, over the next 2 years, reveal himself to be not just a prime suspect, but a case study in psychological manipulation, a master of a dark and destructive art. His every move, every word, every calculated display of feigned grief or righteous indignation was part of a script he was writing in real time, a script meticulously designed to obscure a terrible, violent truth. This is not simply the story of a missing woman. It is an exploration of the void she left behind, and the man who so meticulously cultivated it. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a narcissist. We will peel back the layers of Josh Powell's carefully constructed facade to understand the pathological mindset that fueled his lies. We will examine the psychological warfare he waged, the gaslighting, the manipulation, the victim blaming, and explore how a complete and utter failure of human empathy can curdle into a rage that consumes everything in its path. We will analyze the chillingly methodical mind of a man who would rather erase his family than lose control of his narrative. Susan Cox was born in 1981 in New Mexico and grew up primarily in Puyallup, Washington. She was, by every account, a beacon of light in the lives of those who knew her. Raised in a devout Mormon family by her loving parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, Susan was vibrant, deeply faithful, and filled with a passion for music, particularly the piano. Her friends described her as a ray of sunshine, a woman who radiated a natural warmth and an infectious kindness. She saw the good in people, a trait that is both a gift and, in some circumstances, a vulnerability. In 2000, she met Josh Powell at a singles ward, a Mormon congregation specifically for unmarried young adults. The cultural expectation within the LDS Church often encourages early marriage and family, and Josh, on the surface, seemed to fit the bill. He too came from a large LDS family, but his upbringing was a world away from the stability Susan had known. The Powell family, led by patriarch Susan Powell, was insular and deeply dysfunctional, a fact that would only come into terrifying focus years later. Josh was presented as intelligent, if socially awkward. He worked with computers and was trying to make a living as a day trader, projecting an image of ambition and financial acumen. To Susan, who was just 19, he likely seemed mature and stable. They married quickly in April of 2001. She was 20, he was 25. For a time, the facade of a happy marriage held. They welcomed 2 sons, Charlie in 2005 and Braden in 2007, and Susan embraced motherhood with all her heart. Her journals, photos, and videos from this time are a testament to her deep, unconditional love for her boys. In 2004, they moved from Washington to West Valley City, Utah, into a modest home on Sarah Circle. The move was ostensibly for Josh's career, but in retrospect, it served another purpose. It was the first major step in isolating Susan from her deeply supportive family and friends back in Washington. She got a job as a financial advisor for Wells Fargo, building a career and a life. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect suburban family, a deep and corrosive rot had set in. Josh Powell was not the stable provider he pretended to be. His career as a day trader was a catastrophic failure. The family was hemorrhaging money, and in 2007, they were forced to declare bankruptcy, reporting over $200,000 in debt. The financial strain was immense, but it was merely a symptom of a much deeper, more sinister problem. Josh's obsessive pathological need for control. This control was absolute and suffocating. He controlled every cent, forcing Susan to account for every purchase and providing her with a humiliatingly small allowance. He would monitor the mileage on her car. He was deeply suspicious of her friendships, actively discouraging her from having people over to the house, and speaking ill of her family to drive a wedge between them. He was, in the clinical sense, systematically isolating her. His control extended to every facet of their lives. He was prone to strange, selfish, and impulsive behavior. In one infamous incident, he took Susan and the very young boys to a store, then simply abandoned them there with no money and no way to get home, as a form of punishment for some perceived slight. This is a classic tactic of emotional abuse known as gaslighting, creating a bizarre situation and then blaming the victim for their confused or upset reaction, making them question their own sanity. Susan wasn't passive in this suffocating marriage. By 2008, she was growing increasingly unhappy and increasingly frightened. The evidence of her fear is not speculation. She documented it herself with chilling foresight. That year, she secretly recorded a video, ostensibly to catalog family possessions for insurance purposes. But the tone of the video is somber, and in it, she makes a point of identifying items that are precious to her, as if creating a record for a future she might not be a part of. Even more damning, she drafted a handwritten last will and testament, which she sealed in a safety deposit box. The note began, "To whom it may concern. I, Susan Powell, am writing this for my own protection," she continued with a clarity that is heartbreaking in retrospect. "I want it documented that there is extreme turmoil in our marriage. If I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one." She was trapped. Her deep Mormon faith made the concept of divorce a painful last resort, and her husband had psychologically cornered her. He repeatedly threatened her, telling her that if she ever tried to leave, he would destroy her. He made it clear he would fight for sole custody of the boys, painting her as an unfit mother and ensuring she would lose everything she held dear. It was a campaign of psychological terror. Yet, in the summer of 2009, Susan began to quietly, bravely plan her escape. She opened a secret bank account and began squirreling away money. She confided in her best friend, Kiersey Hellowell, and her family that she was preparing to leave him. She was making her move. Josh Powell, a man whose entire sense of self was built on a fragile foundation of absolute control, must have sensed he was losing his grip. To a malignant narcissist, the loss of control is not just an inconvenience, it is an existential threat. It is a narcissistic injury so profound that it can trigger a terrifying, violent rage. He was a bomb, and Susan's quiet rebellion was the spark lighting the fuse. The last day of Susan Powell's known existence was Sunday, December 6, 2009. It was a day that began with ordinary family routines. Susan took her sons to church. Later that afternoon, her father-in-law, Stephen Powell, and brother-in-law, Michael Powell, came over to the house on Sarah Circle. According to them, the atmosphere was normal. Josh, oddly, decided to make pancakes for dinner. Susan had already prepared chicken noodle soup. After the meal, Stephen and Michael left. They would be the last people, aside from her husband and sons, to ever see her alive. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came the next morning, Monday, December 7th. A series of missed calls and unkept appointments. Susan was a creature of habit, unfailingly reliable. She was supposed to drop Charlie and Braden at their daycare, but they never arrived. The daycare provider, unable to reach Susan or Josh, grew concerned. A worried colleague from Wells Fargo also tried her phone, with no success. By mid-morning, the alarm bells were ringing loudly for everyone who knew her. Josh's mother, Terica Powell, called his work and was told he hadn't shown up. Now a quiet concern began to curdle into real panic. Members of both families, including Susan's father, Chuck Cox, converged on the house at 6254 Sarah Circle. The doors were locked. Susan's car, a Ford Focus, was in the garage. Josh's blue Toyota Sienna minivan was gone. Peeking through a window, they made a critical observation. Susan's purse, containing her wallet, identification, and keys, was sitting on the floor. Susan never went anywhere without her purse. It was a detail so out of character it screamed that something was wrong. After hours of unanswered calls and knocks, the family called the West Valley City Police Department. When officers forced entry into the home, they found a scene that was less like a crime scene and more like a series of strange, unsettling questions. The house was secure, with no signs of a break-in or a struggle, but 2 industrial-strength fans were positioned in the living room, blowing air at high speed onto a large, damp patch on the sofa. Another fan was aimed at a wet spot on the carpet at the foot of the couch. The whirring of the fans was the only sound in the silent house. It was a bizarre, deliberate arrangement. The house was otherwise tidy, almost unnaturally so for a family with 2 young boys. The only thing truly out of place was that stubbornly damp carpet and the frantic, mechanical effort to dry it. And, of course, the fact that the family that was supposed to be living there was gone. A statewide alert was issued. For hours, the whereabouts of the entire Powell family were a complete mystery. Then, at about 6:40 that evening, nearly 24 hours after Susan was last seen alive, Josh Powell pulled into his driveway. In the back of the blue minivan were 4-year-old Charlie and 2-year-old Braden, bundled in winter clothes. Josh himself seemed strangely calm, almost detached, for a man whose wife was the subject of a frantic, multi-agency search. His explanation, when it came, was the story that would define the case and expose the contours of his pathological mind. He told the lead investigator on the scene, Detective Ellis Maxwell, that he had decided on a whim to take the boys camping. He said that around 12:30 in the morning, just after midnight, in the middle of a raging blizzard, he loaded them into the van and drove over an hour away to the Simpson Springs Recreation Area in Tooele County, a remote section of Utah's West Desert. He claimed they'd camped out, making s'mores over a campfire in the driving snow, and that Susan had been at home, asleep and fine when he left. To the seasoned detectives of the West Valley City Police, the story was ludicrous on its face. The weather alone made it unbelievable. The official temperature at the Tooele weather station that night was 17 degrees Fahrenheit, with heavy snowfall and high winds. No responsible father would take toddlers camping in such life-threatening conditions. The timing was bizarre. Why leave after midnight? The location was remote and, in that weather, potentially inaccessible. Furthermore, Josh's demeanor was all wrong. He showed little to no concern for Susan's whereabouts, expressing more frustration at the police presence and the disruption to his routine than any anxiety for his missing wife. He immediately asked for a lawyer, a move that is his constitutional right, but one that shut down any meaningful dialogue with investigators from the very outset. He was building a wall. The holes in his story began to appear almost immediately. He claimed to have used a new generator and propane heater to keep the tent warm, but investigators found no evidence he had recently purchased such items, and no such items were in his van. There was no soot, no mud, no camping debris inside the minivan, which should have been filthy after such a trip. His cell phone records told a different, more damning story. His phone went silent for a crucial 7-hour window, from 12:15 a.m. until about 7 a.m. on Monday morning. But just before it went dark, it pinged a tower that provided coverage to a vast, desolate area of the West Desert, an area far beyond the Simpson Springs campground, an area riddled with hundreds, if not thousands, of abandoned mine shafts, deep, dark holes from a forgotten era of prospecting. Then there was Josh's behavior in the hours and days that followed. It was not the behavior of a frantic, grieving husband. It was the methodical behavior of a man executing a checklist for a cover-up. The day after Susan's disappearance, he took the family minivan to a car wash for a full interior and exterior detail. He rented a car, a Ford Focus identical to Susan's, and put nearly 800 miles on it in a single day, driving from Utah to Nevada and back, a trip for which he could never provide a coherent explanation. He cleaned out the secret bank account Susan had been using to plan her escape. He canceled her credit cards. He contacted a life insurance company about Susan's policy. He was not searching for his wife. He was systematically and efficiently erasing her from existence. The forensic investigation of the Powell home turned up its own disturbing clues. Crime scene investigators used luminol, a chemical that reacts with the iron in hemoglobin, to search for traces of blood. They found a small spot on the tile floor in the dining room, so small it was invisible to the naked eye. DNA testing confirmed it was Susan's. It wasn't enough to prove a murder, but it was direct physical evidence that she had been injured inside that house, a fact that directly contradicted Josh's story that she was perfectly fine when he left. And then there was that wet spot on the carpet. When the police finally pulled it up, the padding underneath had been soaked with a liquid that had been professionally cleaned with a chemical solution. Despite extensive testing, they were never able to determine what the original fluid was, but the presence of the powerful fans pointed to a desperate, last-minute attempt to dry the area, to erase a stain, before anyone could see it. The physical evidence was frustratingly thin. Josh was the only suspect, but the police had no body, no weapon, no confession, and no crime scene. What they had was a mountain of damning circumstantial evidence and the deeply unsettling behavior of a man who was acting profoundly guilty. His interviews with the media were a masterclass in narcissistic manipulation. He would cry for the cameras, but the tears seemed forced, a performance of grief rather than a genuine expression of it. He would talk about his love for Susan, but in the same breath, he would begin to subtly smear her character. He floated theories that she had run off with another man to Brazil, that she was mentally and emotionally unstable, that her disappearance was a calculated, selfish act designed to hurt him. He was simultaneously playing the part of the grieving husband and the wronged victim, casting suspicion on the very woman everyone was desperately searching for. He was trying to control the narrative, to shape a story where he was the hero, or at least the tragic central figure, rather than the villain. His son, 4-year-old Charlie, began to say things. Children that age are not always reliable witnesses. Their memories can be a malleable mix of fact, dream, and fantasy. But what Charlie said was chillingly consistent. He told his grandparents, his teachers, and a forensic interviewer that Mommy was in the trunk. He talked about their camping trip, but his version was different from his father's. He said his mommy came with them but didn't come back. Mommy is in the mine, he once said. We went to a place where there are lots of crystals. The desert where they had supposedly camped was known for its geodes. Josh quickly went on the offensive, launching a public campaign to discredit his own son. He claimed that Susan's family, the Coxes, were coaching Charlie, planting false memories in his head. He began to severely limit their access to the boys, further isolating them inside his web of control and lies. The investigation was a slow, grinding, and frustrating process. Detectives followed every lead. They organized massive, heartbreaking searches in the Utah desert, with hundreds of volunteers on foot and on horseback combing the frozen ground for any sign of Susan. They rappelled into treacherous, abandoned mine shafts, their headlamps cutting through a century of darkness, hoping to find something, anything. But the desert held its secrets close. Josh Powell had chosen his location well. It was a vast, empty wilderness, a place where a person could disappear forever. As the months wore on, Josh's behavior grew more audacious. He seemed to relish the media attention, granting interviews to national news outlets. But his story never changed, never wavered, no matter how many times its glaring inconsistencies were pointed out to him. This is a classic trait of a pathological liar and a narcissist. They believe that if they repeat a lie with enough conviction, it will become the truth in the minds of others. He was not just lying to the police. He was engaged in a full-scale public relations campaign to salvage his own image. The case took an even darker and more bizarre turn when Josh, under the intense scrutiny of the investigation and public opinion in Utah, moved himself and his sons from Sarah Circle back to his childhood home in Puyallup, Washington. He moved in with his father, Susan Powell, and his brother, Michael, if investigators hoped a change of scenery might break the case open, they could never have predicted how. The move didn't just relocate the mystery, it plunged it into a generational cesspool of dysfunction and depravity that would reframe the entire investigation. Susan Powell was not just a supportive father standing by his beleaguered son. He was an active and enthusiastic participant in Josh's campaign of deception and deflection. He granted his own bizarre media interviews, championing Josh's innocence and echoing the cruel, baseless smears against Susan. He claimed Susan was promiscuous, that she had manipulated Josh, that she had likely run away to Brazil with another man named Steve. It was a coordinated, public attack on a missing woman's character, a family affair. But what investigators would soon uncover about Susan Powell was far more disturbing than his public pronouncements. It would reveal a profound sickness at the heart of the Powell family, a sickness that had clearly and tragically infected his son. In August of 2011, almost 2 years after Susan's disappearance, a new search warrant was served, this time on Susan Powell's home in Washington. Investigators were still looking for anything related to Susan, but what they found was a trove of digital and physical evidence that exposed Susan as a dangerous sexual predator. They seized computers and hard drives containing thousands of images of child pornography, specifically focusing on young neighborhood girls he had secretly photographed. But even more horrifying and more directly relevant to Susan's case was the discovery of his personal journals. In meticulous, obsessive handwritten entries, Susan Powell had documented a years-long, deeply disturbing sexual obsession with his own daughter-in-law, Susan. He had stalked her. He had followed her, filmed her, and photographed her without her knowledge, even through her bedroom window. His journals were filled with graphic, violent sexual fantasies about her. He wrote about her in the most degrading terms imaginable, his words a toxic mix of unrequited desire and simmering contempt. He detailed his fantasy of possessing her, of making her his own. The discovery was stomach-turning, but it was also a critical breakthrough in understanding the family's psychology. It demonstrated that Josh was not an anomaly. He was the product of a deeply pathological environment, raised by a man with no moral compass, a man who viewed women not as people, but as objects for his own gratification. The dynamic between father and son was not one of simple support, but of a shared psychosis, a folie à deux where they reinforced each other's darkest impulses and victim-blaming narratives. This discovery also provided a powerful potential motive. Had Susan discovered the extent of Stephen's perversion and threatened to expose the family, prompting Susan Powell was arrested on charges of voyeurism and possession of child pornography. The arrest was a major blow to Josh's carefully curated image of a wholesome, victimized family. With his father in jail, Josh's support system began to crumble. His brother, Michael Powell, who had been a staunch defender and a possible accomplice, came under renewed suspicion. It was discovered that shortly after Susan's disappearance, Michael had inexplicably sold a car to a junkyard, a car that was crushed before police could examine it. The public could now see that the home Josh had taken his sons to was not a refuge, but a viper's nest. The arrest of their grandfather on such heinous charges was the final straw for Washington State's Child Protective Services. For 2 years, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, had been fighting a desperate, agonizing battle for their grandsons. They had watched in horror as Josh manipulated the boys, coached them on what to say, and used them as props in his twisted media campaign. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that the children were in grave danger. Now, with the undeniable evidence of the toxic and abusive environment in the Powell home, a judge finally agreed. In September 2011, Charlie and Braden were removed from Josh Powell's custody and placed in the care of their maternal grandparents, Chuck and Judy. For Josh Powell, this was the ultimate narcissistic injury. The one thing he had maintained absolute control over, his sons, had been taken from him. He had used them as shields, as proof of his normalcy, as his last remaining connection to the life he had so violently destroyed. His entire narrative was built around the image of the loving, single father, wrongfully persecuted by a biased system. The court's decision stripped him of that narrative. It was a public legal declaration that he was unfit, that he was a danger. For a man whose entire identity was built on a fragile scaffolding of superiority and control, this was an unbearable, ego-shattering blow. His meticulously constructed world was collapsing, and he was being exposed for what he truly was. He was granted supervised visits with his sons. These were tense, monitored encounters, often held at a neutral location. Josh chafed under the supervision. He saw it as a humiliation, another cog in the machine of injustice he believed was arrayed against him. His appeals to regain custody failed at every turn. Finally, a judge ordered him to undergo a full psychosexual evaluation, a deep dive into the darkest corners of his mind, an examination he simply could not allow. He was a man with everything to hide. The walls were closing in. The legal pressure was building, and time was running out. He was losing, and Josh Powell was not a man who could tolerate losing. He had always vowed he would destroy Susan before he would let her have the kids. Now, the state had effectively given them to her parents. In his twisted mind, the line had been crossed. He began to plan his final, horrific act of control. The date was February 5, 2012. It was a Sunday, cold and gray in Graham, Washington, where Josh was living in a rental home that he had deliberately chosen for its isolation. The court-appointed visitation supervisor, a social worker named Elizabeth Griffin Hall, arrived at the home of Chuck and Judy Cox to pick up 7-year-old Charlie and 5-year-old Braden for their scheduled visit with their father. The boys, as was often the case, did not want to go. They were happy, they were thriving, they were safe with their grandparents. But the visit was court-ordered. Griffin Hall buckled them into her car and drove them to Josh's house. What happened next unfolded with the chilling speed and precision of a premeditated ambush. As the boys ran ahead of Griffin Hall toward the front door, excited to see their father despite their earlier reluctance, Josh opened it. He quickly ushered them inside, and then slammed and locked the door before the supervisor could enter. She banged on the door, shouting his name, her confusion quickly turning to dread. He was silent. Then she smelled it, the sickening, powerful, unmistakable odor of gasoline. She knew instantly something was terribly, terribly wrong. She backed away from the house, pulling out her cell phone and frantically calling her superiors, her voice trembling with panic. "He's got the kids in the house. He won't let me in. He's not answering. I smell gasoline." Inside the house, Josh Powell was executing the final monstrous phase of his plan. He had spent the previous days liquidating his assets, closing bank accounts, and sending final cryptic emails to his family. One, sent to his lawyer just minutes before the explosion, read simply, "I'm sorry, goodbye." As Elizabeth Griffin Hall was on the line with a 911 operator, her voice cracking with terror, begging for help that was still minutes away, Josh Powell took a hatchet and attacked his 2 young sons. The medical examiner would later confirm that both Charlie and Braden had suffered catastrophic chop wounds to their heads and necks. They may have still been alive when their father, their protector, the man who was supposed to love them more than anything, doused them and the house in gasoline and lit the match. The home erupted in a massive fireball, an explosion so powerful it blew out the windows and shook the entire neighborhood. A column of black smoke billowed into the winter sky. By the time firefighters arrived, the house was a raging inferno, its frame collapsing in on itself. There was no rescue to be made. It was all over in a matter of minutes. The investigators who picked through the smoking rubble found the 3 bodies huddled together in the center of the home. They also found 2 5-gallon gas cans, confirming the act was deliberate. This was not a spontaneous act of desperation. It was a meticulously planned triple murder-suicide. It was Josh Powell's final, horrifying statement to the world. It was the ultimate act of a malignant narcissist, a man so consumed by his own ego and his own narrative that he would rather murder his own children than allow them to live happily with the family of the woman he had almost certainly killed. His final act was not born of love or grief or despair. It was an act of pure, undiluted spite. It was his way of punishing everyone. The Cox family for winning custody, the police for investigating him, the world for not believing his lies. If he could not have his sons, his prized possessions, then no one could. He chose to burn everything down, ensuring that the last chapter of the story was one he wrote himself in fire and blood. In the aftermath of the fire, the last few threads of the Powell family mystery unraveled into tragedy and silence. A year later, in February 2013, Josh's brother, Michael Powell, who had been a key alibi and suspected accomplice, died by suicide, jumping from a parking garage in Minneapolis. He left no note explaining his actions or shedding light on what he knew about Susan's fate. His death closed another critical door for investigators. Josh's father, Stephen Powell, was convicted of his crimes and sent to prison. He died there of natural causes in 2018, taking any remaining secrets he held to his grave. The West Valley City Police officially closed the active investigation into Susan's disappearance in May of 2013. In a final press conference, they named Josh Powell as the sole suspect in her murder. They released their entire case file to the public, a mountain of documents, interviews, and evidence that painted an undeniable picture of his guilt. They revealed that data recovered from a GPS unit Josh had purchased shortly before Susan vanished showed that he had traveled on the night of her disappearance to the area of the Simpson Mountains, the same remote area where he claimed to have gone camping. They also revealed that cadaver dogs had alerted on a spot in the desert not far from there, but an exhaustive excavation of the site turned up nothing. Susan Powell's body has never been found. She remains a missing person, a ghost in a story with a conclusion but no resolution. Her parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, have endured an unimaginable, hellish trinity of loss. They lost their daughter to a predator, and then, in the most brutal way possible, they lost their grandsons to that same predator's final selfish act. They have continued to fight, establishing the Susan Cox Powell Foundation to help victims of domestic violence, trying to wring some small measure of good from an ocean of pain. So we return to our central theme, the anatomy of a narcissist. What does the case of Josh Powell teach us? It shows us that for a person with a severe narcissistic personality disorder, the world is not a place of shared experience, but a stage on which they are the only actor that matters. Everyone else, spouses, children, parents, friends, are merely props, extensions of the self. there to serve the narcissist's needs for admiration, validation, and above all, absolute control. Josh Powell's initial alibi, the absurd camping trip, was not just a weak lie, it was a display of arrogant contempt for the intelligence of others. He believed he was smarter than everyone, that he could construct a story so outlandish that its very audacity would be a form of proof. He fundamentally failed to understand how normal, empathetic human beings think and feel. His every action was a calculated stream of self-preservation and self-aggrandizement. He saw himself as the perpetual victim, a man hounded by police and maligned by his in-laws, all while he was the sole architect of their bottomless suffering. His campaign against Susan's character after her disappearance was a classic tactic of narcissistic devaluation. To maintain his own sense of blamelessness, he had to systematically destroy her reputation, to convince the world, and perhaps himself, that she was flawed, that she was unstable, that she deserved what happened to her. And his final, horrific act was the ultimate expression of narcissistic rage. The court's decision to remove his children was a public refutation of his entire identity. It declared him a failure as a father and a man, unable to tolerate this ego death. He chose a literal one, but not before transforming his personal failure into a public spectacle of horror, ensuring he would be remembered, ensuring he had the last, terrible word. He didn't just kill his sons, he immolated them, a theatrical act of destruction designed for maximum impact and maximum pain for those left behind. There is no mystery about what happened to Charlie and Braden Powell. The horror of their deaths is absolute and known. But the fate of their mother remains an open question, a secret Josh Powell took with him into the flames. He succeeded in one of his primary goals. He has, so far, hidden her forever. The silence from that patch of Utah desert is a testament to his cold, calculated, and enduring cruelty. It is the sound of an empty space, a void meticulously crafted by a man who was himself a psychological and moral void. The official search for Susan Powell is over, but the search for understanding the dark corners of the human mind that her story illuminates will never truly end. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.